There is a silence at the heart of British history, a place where the records stop and the questions begin. Of all the peoples who once walked this island, few are as famous, as feared, or as poorly understood as the Picts. They terrified the legions of Rome. They ruled much of what is now Scotland. They carved extraordinary stones that still stand in lonely fields, covered in symbols no one can fully read. And then, somewhere in the dim corridors of the early Middle Ages, they seem to vanish. The name fades, the kingdoms disappear. The Picts, we are told, were gone. But what if they never truly disappeared? What if modern DNA has uncovered where they went? And what if your own family, the people who handed down your surname, your features, the place your grandparents came from, what if that family carries a thread of this forgotten story? These are not questions for historians alone. They are questions that may touch your own ancestry. If you find yourself drawn to uncovering the hidden stories behind British ancestry, the peoples who came before the peoples we know, then this is a journey worth taking, and it is one we return to again and again on this channel. Subscribe, and you will never miss a discovery. The mystery of the Picts begins not with what we know, but with what we do not. We know they were there. We know they mattered. Roman writers mention them, sometimes with awe, sometimes with fear. Their carved stones survive by the hundreds, scattered across the landscape of eastern and northern Scotland. Their names echo faintly in later Scottish tradition. Yet they left no written chronicles of their own, no shells of parchment in a Pictish script telling us who they believe themselves to be. What survives is stone and silence, and the testimony of outsiders. This absence is what makes the Picts Britain's greatest missing people. Not missing because they were unimportant, but missing because the record of them was never theirs to write. They are a shadow cast by other people's words, a people known largely through the unease they provoked in others. So who, truly, were they? That unease began with Rome. Picture it for a moment. You are standing on Hadrian's Wall at first light. The mist is low over the Moor-Seaton stone, and the wind carries the smell of wet grass and cold iron. Somewhere beyond the wall, in the grey drift of the morning, figures are watching. Figures who have watched from these moors for longer than the empire at your back has existed. This was not a frontier Rome chose to forget. It was a frontier Rome chose not to cross. When the legions pushed into the far north of Britain, they met a resistance unlike any they had encountered elsewhere on the island. The Roman frontier in Britain was never a settled line for long. Walls were built, abandoned, rebuilt, shifted. The most enduring of these, Hadrian's Wall, marked not the edge of the Roman world in some absolute sense, but a decision, a recognition that the lands beyond held a people Rome chose not to fully absorb. Later excursions north, under emperors like Septimius Severus, brought temporary reach, but no lasting hold. The Romans came, they campaigned, they withdrew, and beyond their walls life continued on its own ancient terms. Why couldn't Rome conquer so much of the known world, yet hold so little of this? The word Picti itself is a Roman Latin word, meaning the painted ones. Whether it was a name these people used for themselves, we do not know. Some scholars have argued it referred to tattooing or body painting, a practice remarked upon by classical observers of northern peoples. Others caution that the term may have been a vague Roman label for a complex of northern groups, rather than a single unified nation. Did they really paint themselves? And if they did, what did those marks mean? The question leads us deeper, not closer to an answer, because the people who could have told us left no written word on the subject. What is clear is that, by the late Roman period, the name had stuck, applied to the peoples living beyond the northern frontier. To Rome, they were the symbol of what lay outside imperial order, untamed, unreachable, and unwilling to be quietly absorbed. The reasons Rome found them so difficult are not hard to grasp. The land itself fought on their side. Dense forests, deep glens, weather that could turn a campaign into a catastrophe, and distances that stretched supply lines past breaking. Warfare in such country rewarded mobility, ambush, and knowledge of the terrain, advantages that favored those who lived there over those who arrived. But it was not only the land. The peoples beyond the wall had their own political structures, their own ambitions, and their own long memories. They were not scattered bands waiting to be organized. They were kingdoms with rulers, lineages, and rivalries of their own. Life in those kingdoms was woven from threads we can only partly recover. Archaeology gives us fragments, the remains of fortified settlements, the outlines of roundhouses, the traces of farming and craft. We can see a society rooted in its landscape, working its land, raising its livestock, building and rebuilding in stone and timber. We can glimpse networks of power in the carved stones that mark significant places, crosses, animals, abstract symbols whose meanings remain debated. Religion, too, shifted over the centuries of Pictish history. Earlier beliefs gave way to Christianity, which arrived from several directions and reshaped the spiritual landscape, as it did across the early medieval north. The famous symbol stones, some carved before Christianization, some after, stand as the most eloquent witnesses we have. They show us a people with a sophisticated visual language, capable of abstraction and storytelling alike, even if the precise grammar of that language is a still. Can anyone read the Pictish symbols? Generations of scholars have tried. The temptation is to treat them like hieroglyphs, waiting for a Rosetta Stone, but they may not be a script at all. They may be something closer to emblems, marks of lineage and identity that we can admire, but never fully decode. And that, in its own way, is part of their power. They were never meant for us to read. They were meant for those who already understood. And then the questions close in. What happened to them? This is where the documentary risks becoming legend. The popular story is simple. The Picts vanished. The more honest story is messier, and far more interesting. There was no single dramatic disappearance. What we see instead is a slow transformation, recorded unevenly in sources, written long after the events they describe. The Pictish kingdoms of the early medieval period were drawn into a wider Gaelic-speaking world, through alliance, marriage, conquest, and the simple pressure of cultural and political change. The Kingdom of Ulster emerged, a name that would in time give us Scotland itself. The old name the Picts fell out of use, not because the people were gone, but because the political identity that name described had been replaced by a new one. This is the heart of the confusion. The disappearance of a name is not the disappearance of a people. The Picts did not need to be wiped out in order to vanish from the record. They needed only to stop being called Picts. Theories abound, and historians debate them still. Some stress the role of the Gaelic-speaking Scots of Dalriada, whose dynasty came to rule the combined kingdom. Others point to the influence of the Church, of literacy in Latin and Gaelic rather than any vernacular, and to the way new political identities overwrite old ones. The truth is almost certainly a combination of these forces, acting over generations. No chronicle announces a single moment of extinction, because there was no such moment. There was change, gradual, partial, uneven change, and at the end of it, the name had gone, while the people, in all likelihood, had not. But here is the puzzle that follows. If the people stayed, what happened to their language? Why did Pictish, whatever it sounded like, leave so little trace in the speech of later Scotland? Some linguists believe it was a pre-Celtic tongue, related to Brittonic. Others suspect it may have held older, more enigmatic layers. Whatever it was, it did not survive the shift to Gaelic. Languages die, but the people who speak them do not necessarily die with them. They learn new words, teach them to their children, and carry on. So the silence of Pictish should be a silence of people at all, but the silence of a tongue that was simply left behind.
For a long time, that was where the question had to rest. Informed inference from thin and late sources. Then ancient DNA changed the conversation entirely. In recent years, archaeogenetics has begun to recover genetic material from human remains buried across Britain and Ireland, including in the heartlands of what had been Pictish territory. These studies do not hand us neat labels. They do not let us point at a skeleton and declare it definitively Pictish. What they do is something subtler, and, in its way, more powerful. They let us compare the genetic signatures of people who lived centuries or millennia ago with the genetic signatures of people alive today. Researchers suggest that in parts of northern and eastern Scotland, there are strong signals of population continuity. Patterns in which the ancient and the modern appear to be drawn from the same deep well of ancestry. Even as later arrivals added their own threads, evidence indicates that the major genetic shifts in Britain came earlier than the early medieval period, not during it. The transformations that followed Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman left their marks, but they did not erase the populations already there. In the former Pictish lands, archaeological and genetic findings together point towards a story of absorption and continuity rather than wholesale replacement. DNA studies reveal, broadly, a landscape in which newcomers arrived and settled among existing populations, contributing to the mix without removing it. This matters enormously for the question of disappearance. If the land was not emptied, if the people were not replaced, then the descendants of those early medieval inhabitants are still with us. They did not need to migrate anywhere. They stayed, and the world changed around them. And their descendants kept being born in the same glens and straths and coastal plains their ancestors had known. Care is needed here. Geneticists and historians are careful to stress what ancient DNA can and cannot show. It can illuminate broad patterns of ancestry and continuity across populations. It cannot and does not identify any living individual as a descendant of the Picts in some exclusive or provable sense. The category Pict is itself a Roman-era label for a shifting political world, not a clean genetic boundary. What the science offers is evidence, not a certificate, a picture built from many graves. Many samples, many comparisons. Anyone who promises you a DNA test that will tell you that you are Pictish is promising more than the evidence will bear. What honest research offers is something more humble and more enduring. A strong case that the people of early medieval northern and eastern Scotland did not vanish, and that their genetic legacy forms part of the ancestry of the region's modern population. But here's the curious part. Continuity is not evenly spread. Why do some regions show stronger threads to the ancient dead than others? The answer seems to lie in geography. Remoter valleys, thinner soils, and lands less attractive to later migrants tended to hold on to what they had. The places that look most ancient today are often the places that were hardest to reach. So where might that legacy be found today? Look at the map of former Pictish territory, and you are looking at a swath of modern Scotland that still bears the traces of older worlds. The Highlands, with their deep straths and long sea locks. Moray, with its rich lowland soils and its long history of power. Aberdeenshire, where carved stones still rise from farmers' fields. Perthshire and Angus, where the old heartlands of Pictish power lay. Caithness, exposed and wind-scoured at the very edge. Orkney, with its astonishing density of ancient remains, where layer upon layer of human presence is written into the land itself. These are the regions where, historically, the Picts were most at home, and these are the regions where the question of continuity becomes most pointed. If your family comes from these places, from Moray, from Buchan, from Strathorn, from the lands around the Moray Firth or the Angus coast, the question is not whether ancient people lived there. They did abundantly. The question is whether your line happens to be among those who stayed. Could your own family have lived in these valleys, walked these same shores, and never known it? This is the moment the documentary stops being about someone else and starts being about you. Imagine for a moment a particular stretch of country, say, the low hills above the Moray Firth, where the light comes in flat and gold across the fields in the late afternoon. A family has farmed there for as long as anyone can remember. The father learned the boundaries from his father, who learned them from his, and the names of those boundaries have not changed in any living memory. Now picture the same field 1,500 years ago. A man stands where the modern farmer stands, looking across the same slope, calling the same stream by something close to the same name. He is not a ghost. He is an ancestor, or he has nothing to do with you. You may never know which. But the possibility, the quiet, persistent possibility, is the thing that does not let go. If you have Scottish ancestry, or if you have ever taken a DNA test, take a moment and put it in the comments. Tell us your surname, where your family comes from, and whether you have ever wondered about roots older than the names you know. The patterns in the comments are often extraordinary. It's the same regions, the same surnames, the same half-remembered family stories, surfacing again and again. Because the clues, when you know how to look, are everywhere, and they are not only in surnames. Surnames are the most obvious starting point, but they are also the most slippery. Many modern surnames took shape only in the Middle Ages, long after the name Pict had faded. Some hint at older regional roots. Some were imposed, adopted, or changed. Surname alone proves very little. But surnames do not stand alone. They sit inside a wider landscape of evidence, and it is the combination that begins to tell a story. Place names are one of the quietest and most revealing witnesses. Across the former Pictish lands, certain place name elements, often of Celtic or Pre-Gaelic origin, survive in the names of farms, hills, rivers, and parishes. These names outlasted the kingdoms that bore them, carried forward by ordinary people who simply kept calling places what their grandparents had called them. Where these older names clustered, they suggest a deep continuity of speech and settlement, even when the political world above them changed beyond recognition. To grow up in a place whose name has been spoken in something close to its current form for over 1,000 years is to stand inside an unbroken thread of memory. Have you ever wondered why your ancestors stayed in the same place for centuries? What kept them there? What made leaving unthinkable? Clan histories point in a similar direction, though with their own complications. Many Highland clans trace their origins to a mix of Gaelic, Norse, and older regional lines, and their genealogies, often written down long after the facts they claim, must be read with care. Yet beneath the later embellishments, clan traditions frequently preserve a genuine memory of place. This family belonged to this glen, this kindred held this stretch of coast. When a clan's traditional heartland sits squarely within former Pictish territory, the question of deeper roots becomes unavoidable, even if it cannot be answered cleanly. What stories were passed down in your family? Small ones, half-believed ones, the kind a grandparent told once and never repeated. Then there are the landscapes themselves. The archaeological record of northern and eastern Scotland is not something locked away in museums. It is underfoot. Standing stones, brocks, hill forts, early Christian sites, these are part of the everyday fabric of the regions in question. Families who have farmed the same land for generations have lived among these remains as a matter of course. That proximity does not, by itself, establish descent, but it does something important. It anchors the present in a physical past, reminding us that the people who raised those stones were not phantoms. They were communities, working the same soils, looking out across the same horizons. Historical records add another strand. Parish registers, kirk session minutes, land charters, tax rolls, actiments. Of the early modern and medieval centuries, let us trace particular families in particular places across centuries. When a name recurs in the same small parish for 300 or 400 years, the odds of genuine local continuity become considerable. And behind those written records lies something older still: oral tradition. The family stories that pass down through generations, tales of origin, of belonging, of a grandmother from the far north, of a line that was always there, are not proof, but they are evidence of a kind, the residue of memory where parchment runs out. Taken together, surname, place, clan, landscape, record, story. And where available, genetic testing, these threads can weave a picture. No single thread proves Pictish descent. The honest claim is more modest and more interesting, that certain families show strong signs of having been there for a very long time. Long enough that their ancestors would have been counted among the peoples of the early medieval North, whatever names those peoples later went by. This is why the Picts never truly disappeared. The kingdoms fell. Yes, the name faded. The language, whatever it was, gave way to others. But kingdoms and names and languages are not people. People endure. They marry. They have children. They bury their dead. They pass on their customs and their land and their stories. The political roof of Pictland came down, and a new roof, Alba, then Scotland, was raised in its place. But the household beneath remained. Many historians, drawing on archaeology, on documentary evidence, and now on ancient DNA, believe that the Pictish peoples were not exterminated or driven into the sea. They became part of the larger Scottish nation that grew up in their lands, contributing their ancestry, their regional cultures, and their memory of place to a world that no longer called them by their old name. If that is right, and the weight of evidence leans that way, then the great mystery was never really where the Picts went. We have been looking for an ending when there was a continuation. The question that should haunt us is different. It is not what happened to them. It is how many of us are them. History remembers the Picts as a people who vanished. But history often remembers kingdoms more clearly than families. Kingdoms fall. Names change. Languages disappear. Yet people endure. Perhaps the greatest mystery was never where the Picts went, Perhaps it is that millions of their descendants have been living among us all along, unaware that their own family story stretches back to one of Britain's most enigmatic peoples. Perhaps the greatest secret of the Picts was never how they disappeared, but how they survived without anyone noticing. If that idea stirs something in you, then you belong here. Subscribe for more documentaries exploring Britain's forgotten peoples. The surnames that carry their memory, the ancient kingdoms that shaped our landscape, and the family origins that connect us more than we know to a deeper past.